The moment I stepped into the ballroom, someone called me a stinky country girl. It came from the edge of a laughter circle, sharp and light the way a thrown glass is light until it shatters. The chandelier above them caught the word and tossed it back in 100 little glints. For a second, I felt the old muscle memory of it, the way my shoulders tightened when somebody decided to remind me where I came from. Then I looked down. My boots were on Italian marble. The heels clicked with the measured patience of someone who had counted the tiles of this floor more times than she could remember. They didn't know who they were talking to. This was my hotel. Not in the boastful, spray-painted way of some overnight success. In the slow, stubborn way of someone who had shown up early, cleaned rooms until her fingers ached, learned the ledger books, navigated contractors who promised more than they delivered, and answered 1,000 small disasters at 3 a.m. until the business became something someone else could run. I had the deed, I had the accounts, I had the manager who kept the boilers working and the keys aligning. I had private offices with framed invoices I kept as reminders. And they had their tiny, practiced cruelty, the one people in new places carry like costume jewelry. The bride, Sloane, raised her glass and laughed with the kind of bright, studied ease you see on magazine covers and in commercials. She had the composure of someone who'd spent a long time learning how to look like she belonged. Her friends smoothed their dresses and exchanged the kind of looks that said, without saying, "We're better than you." My sister, Claire, stood near the head table with her head tilted in that fragile, happy way brides do when they are trying to be everything for everyone. She was laughing, yes, but there was a tremor to it I couldn't place, as if progress had a cost she was determined not to think about. Our mother, Patricia, sat beside her and clapped the way mothers do when they have rehearsed their joy. Patricia's hands had always been a map of tired love, calloused in places where a softer hand would be smooth. Tonight, though, they twirled the necklace at her throat like it was a new prop in a life she had sorted into categories of what looked presentable. The necklace was my grandmother's, a thin chain, a locket with a glassy miniature portrait that had survived 100 generations of washing, moving, and being misplaced. When I was a kid, I used to hide it in my pocket and pretend I'd one day wear it for something big. I didn't tell Claire that 3 years ago, when bills threatened to turn her world inside out, I had sat up late and sent the first anonymous check. I didn't want my charity to be a spectacle. I wanted it to be a safety net, a quiet thing like the mattress springs under a bed. That night, watching my mother clasp the locket around Claire's neck with a theatrical flourish, I felt something small and tight uncoil in my chest. It was the old shame-buried pride that arrives when people give you a place of honor you've earned in secret. "She looks as if she might remember where she came from," someone murmured behind me, the voice sliding over the tile like a dropped napkin. I smiled. Not the quick one I kept in reserve for courtesies, but the one you get when a plan you've been methodically building starts to line up with the world. In the light of the chandeliers, the room was a photograph you could step into. Champagne syrup, a fountain that hissed like a living thing, tablecloths folded with surgical precision. There were ice sculptures and a DJ who'd been hired for the exact number of people who would ooh at the ice sculptures. It was perfect, the way illusion is perfect, shiny and shallow. And yet, even in a ballroom arranged to convince people they were safe, there were small cracks. Sloane's hands were slightly damp when she held the glass. Franklin and Delilah Whitmore, the gracious, retired philanthropist parents who'd flown in from across the country, kept checking their phones the way people check to see if a storm they can't control has changed course. Franklin's laugh was a fraction too loud. Delilah's collar had a thread come loose that nobody would have noticed if not for the way she kept tugging at it. Those were the things people who learned to look for openings see, tiny, inconsistent tremors in a practiced calm. That's where the differences between posture and reality live. I hadn't come that night as some secret vigilante. I'd come to give my sister a day she could point to and say, "This is mine." I'd paid for the chef, negotiated the music package, overseen the linens. I'd performed all those invisible labors that turn a hall into a memory. When the whisper came, it hit the old place in me, but it also landed on something newer, a responsibility that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with protection. Claire was about to sign her name to someone whose hands trembled more often than they laughed. If the tremor came from fear and not joy, I wanted to be the one to understand why. I stepped away from the head table with a cup of coffee I hadn't meant to drink. The kitchen corridor that separated the ballroom from the service rooms smelled like lemon oil and exhaustion. It was a narrow place, utility doors on either side, and the hum of refrigeration above our heads. That's where I heard the phone ring. It was Sloane's number flashing in the glass of a pass-through window. Her voice came thin through the aperture. At first I thought it was the practiced small talk most people lob into phones at weddings. Schedule checks, last-minute directions, protocol. Then the cadence changed. Panic slid into the vowels. "We don't have the signature yet," she said. "No, listen to me. If we don't close in Arizona next week, the investors start calling. Franklin said he can stall them, but if Claire says no, no, it can't be Claire. She's the key. We need the marriage license, the transfer, everything lined up. I promised Delilah Yes, I know, but the accounts are tied to her name. You said you had the shell under Whitmore Holdings. Don't mess it up. I can't lose this. The words hit me like a cold that had been kept in a drawer and then forgotten. Shell under Whitmore Holdings. A name I knew because I dealt with businesses that hid in plain sight. Investors calling if they don't close. The voice went on with terms people use when they're trying to make the future look like a fact. I listened because listening is something I do for a living. I listen for complaints, for requests, for the way a problem is rehearsed in other people's mouths until it becomes their truth. When she hung up, the hand that had the phone clutched it so hard her knuckles whitened. Sloane's shoulders were hunched like someone trying to make herself small in a hallway built to move plates and empty boxes. Delilah and Franklin lingered near the delivery door, smiling at a caterer with a plastic apron as if they had nothing to worry about. I rinsed my cup in the utility sink and had to press my palms against the steel to keep standing. My first thought was practical, call Wesley. My second thought was less noble, enlighten the smug circle in the ballroom. Neither of those thoughts were the action I took. I straightened my jacket until the seam at my shoulder sat where it should, and walked back into the ballroom with a face that was calm because it had to be calm. Claire came to meet me, arms open in the way sisters do when they haven't seen each other for a while but are trying to be a part of each other's joy. You made it, she said, and in her voice I heard relief and a little bewilderment that I was standing there, not calling to cancel. I'm so glad. I wouldn't miss this for the world, I said. I wanted to tell her then, in the undercurrent that runs beneath every family conversation, that the necklace meant something beyond sparkle, that there had been anonymous envelopes, that I'd kept a corner of my life to catch hers when it slipped. I wanted to tell her how I'd watched her tuck manicured hands into pockets when she felt outsiders' eyes, how I had once been the outsider and had learned the slow arithmetic of how to stop being overlooked. Instead, I hugged her and felt the tremor in her spine again. She smelled like gardenias and nervousness. If you like this kind of story, hit subscribe, I found myself thinking, absurdly aware that the audience inside me who watched and cataloged moments had learned how to pause for effect. I didn't say it out loud, that would have been ridiculous, but I kept the thought like a tiny switch in my pocket, quiet, ready. That night, I didn't act like someone who is about to take a dramatic stand. I moved like someone who was doing her job. I checked the bar tab, nodded to the band leader, asked Wesley to keep an eye on the exit doors. Wesley Crane had been my general manager for 3 years. He knew how to read stains on credit statements the way other people read face tattoos. He'd been the one who found the stray ledger online when we had thought we'd lost it. He was the man who knew how to make a wedding run without anyone suspecting the anchor that kept it from sinking. Keep the caterer on schedule, I told him quietly in the kitchen doorway, and make sure nothing goes out of the ballroom without my say. He nodded. Already on it. You okay? Fine, I said. Just keep your eyes open. Wesley's eyes were kind and practical. He had a habit of making decisions that looked small on the surface but mattered later. He agreed to check guest lists, quietly verify vendors, and keep an eye on Sloane's party. It was the sort of task you give someone you trust, the mundane things that make extraordinary things manageable. By the time the first course was announced, I had already started to pull at a thread that, I hoped, unraveled into facts. I found Rebecca Thornton in the sitting room, looking like a woman who had chosen the right shoes for both a runway and a courtroom. Rebecca had been my attorney since I bought the hotel. She'd argued contractors into submission and negotiated leases that read like victory speeches. When she saw me, she raised a brow. You look like you found something, she said. I did, I said, and told her the bare bones of the hallway conversation, only the things that would matter in the light of proof. Rebecca's mouth tightened in that way lawyers' mouths do when they calculate risk. You shouldn't have eavesdropped, she said, gently, but we can use it. It's probable cause to start asking questions, not proof. We'll need more. What kind of more? Financial records, incorporation documents, any overlapping accounts, names tied to the shell companies. If there's a pattern of money being moved out of investor accounts into personal siphons, that's criminal. She spoke in the clean, pragmatic way of someone whose life had been dedicated to turning gasps into evidence. I don't want to ruin Claire's day, I said. The words tasted like guilt. I don't want to humiliate her. Rebecca's face softened. It's why you came to me, she said. We don't humiliate. We verify. We present facts. If Claire is a victim, we protect her. If she's complicit, well, that's something she'll have to answer to. Naomi Delaney arrived before midnight. She looked at the room like someone who cataloged small irregularities for a hobby. Naomi was a forensic accountant with neat hair and a mind that turned chaos into spreadsheets. She had the habit of moving like someone who always had the next step already planned. I sat with her in the back office where the wedding linens were stored and showed her the notes I'd scribbled, names and fragments and the little things Sloane had said under her breath. Naomi didn't laugh or gasp. She made a mark on her tablet and asked me where one of the donor checks had come from. "Who in your family has access to funds that could be mistaken for hidden wealth?" she asked. Her question was clinical, but it cut to the heart of why Sloane and her circle might target Claire's family. "Mom and Claire have nothing that resembles secret accounts," I said, "but I do have a few arrangements for emergencies. Anonymous funds I set aside 3 years ago when the bank came after Claire." Naomi nodded like she already suspected the solution. Often con artists start with a narrative. They pick a family with a little blush of wealth, someone who can be presented as philanthropic or reserve rich, and use marriage to bind names together. It's easier to move money when it looks like a joint family enterprise. We worked through lists while glasses chimed in the next room. Naomi made calls to check public records, Arizona filings, business registries, charity incorporations. She found a Whitney Holdings registration in Arizona with an address that matched a mail drop company. She traced payments that looked circular, money that came from investor accounts, moved through shell companies, and then returned as consulting fees to accounts under members of the Whitmore household. The pattern had all the hallmarks of a Ponzi-style arrangement. New funds used to pay earlier investors, creating the illusion of returns while the underlying principals siphoned cash. By 2 a.m, Naomi had piles of printed documents and a list of banks and accounts we could move to subpoena. She pointed to entries that were bold-faced and obvious, not because they were sloppy, but because they were common. They weren't careful, she said. They relied on show, on distracting people with dinner and diamonds while moving money through places most people don't look. It felt like discovering a loose board in a stage set that, when pulled, showed the trap door underneath. Rebecca made the calls we needed to make. She spoke to a contact who was a federal agent in financial crimes. There are codes for this: fraud, wire transfer records, interstate commerce. But what matters is that she patched our thread of suspicion into a legal loom. The agent listened, then asked for what she always asks: documentation. "We need a chain of what you've got," she said. "Statements, filings, correspondences. We'll verify, and if it meets the threshold, we'll open an investigation." Rebecca and Naomi worked their way through a stack of papers, and by pre-dawn they had enough to draw a map. Not a perfect map, you can't make a perfect map in a night, but a path that led from the Whitmore accounts to places where investor funds had pooled and then been redeployed. Rebecca said, "This is enough to get the attention of the right people. Not enough to prosecute tonight, but enough to open a formal inquiry." When I asked whether the agent could be present at the wedding, Rebecca gave me a look I recognized from contracts and bank closings. "We can request presence for precautionary reasons," she said. "If there's a danger of flight, they'll prioritize, but no law enforcement agency will arrest on the word of a private party without verification. That's the bedrock. We'll ask them to be on standby once they've had a look at the filings." What followed was the kind of moral calculus no one likes to do in the middle of a room full of toasts and taffeta. If this was a fraud, Claire, my sister, was either a pawn or an accomplice. If she was a pawn, exposing Sloane would save her and the other victims. If she was an accomplice, exposing Sloane would break our family. Either way, inaction meant allowing more people to be victims. It is one thing to watch a room and feel the tremor in someone's laugh. It is another thing to turn that tremor into an action plan that will change lives. I spent the moments between courses imagining both the worst and the best. I could see Sloane's face if we were wrong, if we had misinterpreted nervousness as guilt. I could see Claire's face if we were right, if the marriage was a conduit for theft. Neither image felt casual. Both felt like the weight of a decision I would have to live with. That's when I thought of the necklace again. When Patricia placed Grandma's locket on Claire, she did it with a showy hush, as if historical weight could be transferred by hand. The locket dangled and caught the light. At one point, as someone grazed past the head table, the tiny catch snagged on a seam, and the locket slid, hitting the edge of the table and falling to the floor with a small, startling clink that sounded much like a dropped coin. The room went quiet, like the moment in a play when the actor decides whether to be honest. Claire bent to pick up the locket, and when she reached down, her shoulder brushed against Sloane's. Sloane's eyes flicked to the locket and then to Claire with the kind of calculation you see when someone is measuring usefulness. It was a look that told me more than any whisper. I picked up the locket before Claire could. It was warm from the lights and the bodies around it. Inside the glass, the portrait of my grandmother looked small and steady, like a lighthouse in a miniature flood. For a moment, holding it, all the years of work and the secret checks felt like they coalesced into a single thing made of gold and intent. I had tucked away those checks because I wanted Claire to have the choice, to find her footing without feeling beholden, to know she was not alone. I had wanted to protect her from the humiliation of needing and not asking, from the vulnerability that makes families a target. "What are you doing?" Claire asked, gentle, confused. "Keeping brittle things from breaking," I said. I handed the locket to her with both hands, like an offering and a warning in equal measure. She took it, her fingers closing over the chain as if to anchor herself. Later, in the quiet moments between dessert and the part where people melt back into the night, I sat with the locket on my calm and thought about how it signified both generosity and leverage. I thought about how con artists pick at the seams of families, where marriage is currency and sympathy is a key, and how easy it is for love to be leveraged into the appearance of trustworthiness. We moved carefully. Rebecca filed a preliminary complaint with the Financial Crimes Unit and arranged a time for Naomi to deliver her working notes. Naomi compiled a dossier that was less dramatic than the movies, but far more damning. Bank routing numbers, dates of transfers, names of shell companies. The difference between a crime and a story is often a record. We began to assemble records. Rebecca's contact, Agent Carla Reeves, called me at 3 a.m. She had the voice of someone who had learned to speak plainly, so people on both sides of a problem could understand the stakes. She asked direct questions, took detailed notes, and then said point-blank that she would send a liaison to the hotel to look over what we had. She was clear that arrests were not automatic, that a careful chain of custody and corroboration would be required. She also said, in a way that made the hair on my arm stand up, that if there was evidence of flight risk or of funds being moved out of reach, they could act swiftly. I told myself in the quiet of the linen closet that this was about stopping harm, not spectacle. I told myself that if Claire had been deceived, it would be kinder to show her the truth gently. Rebecca shook her head at that and said, "If you tell Claire gently and she doesn't believe you, the harm continues. If you don't tell her and this burns the family, worse. We don't do gentle when fraud affects others. We do precise." So we planned, not a vindictive trap, but a procedure. I would use the toast. Toasts are the moments when cameras are trained and attention converges on one voice. The head table was scheduled precisely. The screens above the dais were controlled from the tech booth my assistant and I had worked out months earlier. It was not difficult logistically to imagine a moment when the screens could shift from the sentimental slideshow to bank statements that made the pattern clear. But our plan was not to make Claire look foolish in front of her friends. It was to present incontrovertible facts to law enforcement in a way that prevented flight and protected other victims. There were a dozen reasons not to do it: reputation, family privacy, the possibility of being wrong. But there were also reasons to act. People had invested money under a facade. There were accounts that had small widows' annuities listed, and company payrolls that evaporated into personal accounts. I thought of the way the Whitmores had laughed, and the way Franklin had fumbled his phone. I thought of a mother clapping while holding a family relic, and deciding, with the reckless optimism of the desperate, to believe the easiest story. At dawn, while the staff packed linens and the band's van idled outside, Wesley found me sitting in the back office with a stack of invoices and a thermos of coffee gone cold. He sat opposite me, elbows on his knees, the way he did when his face wanted to say something, but his job required a different tone. "We'll need AV access," he said. "I can get the tech in the booth to cue the screens, but you have to be sure." "I am," I said. "You know what calling law enforcement to the hotel will do," he said. "Even if they don't arrest tonight, the word gets out." "Maybe it's better if the word gets out," I said. "If people see the evidence, they'll know we're not flinging mud. We're handing them documents." Wesley rubbed his jaw. "Claire?" "She matters to me," I said, "but she's not a safe partner for other people if this is what it looks like. If she's deceived, we save her. If she's complicit..." I stopped. The possibility had the taste of iron. "It won't be pretty," he said. "Nothing worth fixing ever is," I said. We set the technical piece in motion like a low-key act of faith. I called the tech lead and asked for a harmless favor: keep the playlist queued until the head table's mic was passed. When the time came, the screens could be switched. The last thing I wanted was a spectacle of vengeance. The last thing I wanted was to do nothing. For most of the afternoon, I rehearsed my restraint. In the stairway, I watched Sloane adjust her dress with an almost panicked efficiency. In the ladies' powder room, she ran her fingers through her hair and checked the neatness of her lashes, as though that too was a thing that could be used to buy time. Franklin joked loudly about a non-existent investment seminar. Delilah chatted in clipped tones about estate planning in a way that made my skin prickle. Every small mannerism was a thread. People imagine decisive moments as singular and crisp, like the clap before a curtain falls. In truth, they are built of tiny commitments. Choosing to look, choosing to verify, choosing to involve the right people. Those are the bricks of a decision that will hold when the storm comes. The guest list was full of familiar names, old family friends, vendors I knew, a few investors no one anticipated. I recognized one man at a corner table whose hand lingered on a program. I kept an eye on how people positioned themselves in the room, who left the hall for phone calls, who looked at the doors like they were calculating routes. When Claire came over to me, leaning in with the kind of confessional smile brides wear before they are fully brave, I felt both the ache of sisterhood and the steel of resolve. "Are you sure you'll be here for the toast?" she asked. She was a bride asking for emotional solidarity, and I had no right to steal it from her. She smiled the way people do when they hope a parent won't say no. I wouldn't miss it, I said. I meant it. I did not expect what would follow. When the DJ cued the music for the speeches, the hum in the ballroom shifted. Glasses clicked, forks rested, and the light seemed to settle on the faces at the head table. People leaned forward in expectation. Claire's eyes found mine across the sea of people, and there was a look of pure happiness that made my chest hurt. She was not yet aware that a version of the evening existed that could save lives, but would also split us in ways that take time to stitch back together. Rebecca came up behind me with the kind of face lawyers get when they are preparing to perform a delicate maneuver. Naomi was there too, laptop under her arm, with printouts tucked like talismans. Agent Carla Reeves's liaison had arrived in civil clothes and was waiting in the periphery with the quiet composure of someone who had seen the kind of theater that often accompanies fraud. He nodded once at Rebecca, a greeting made of procedure and necessity. I stood, smoothing my jacket, because the old part of me that had catalogued every seam in a uniform still wanted to appear composed. The microphone was passed to me with that brittle handoff that means everyone has agreed to trust whatever you say next. I took the stand not as a woman who wanted an audience, but as someone with a responsibility heavier than any applause. The room tensed the way it does right before laughter or thunder. My sister was at the center of it, a halo of soft-lipped expectation. The DJ faded. The screens that had been showing the slideshow with photos of Claire and Sloane as they posed by sunsets and sea cliffs were cued with images we had not intended to show. They were innocuous in the beginning, a sequence of childhood photos, a slow build to toast-worthy cliches. But behind the scenes, a different sequence was waiting. I inhaled. The clink of glass became a distant memory. I was aware of the boots I'd once worn to clean this very floor, of the first check I'd sent in secret, of the night spent reading ledgers by lamplight. I was aware, too, of how small offenses like a phrase, stinky country girl, had a calibration to them. They were designed to keep people quietly in their places. I had spent the last decade deciding I liked my place where I could see everyone. When I lifted the microphone, I felt the weight of everything hinge on the next breath. When I cleared my throat and lifted the microphone, the room shrank the way a hand dims a picture until you can focus on only one face. For a moment, everything was suspended. The clinks, the soft chatter, the DJ's practiced fade. Claire was smiling at me from the head table, the kind of smile that holds 1,000 tiny approvals. I thought of the first anonymous check I'd sent her when her landlord had come with a notice. I thought of the stain on my palms after a 12-hour shift, and how I swore I'd leave a foundation of steadiness under whatever she built. "Thank you all for coming," I said, and my voice was steady because it had to be. "I could tell you how grateful I am that you're sharing this day with my sister. I could tell you the way Claire has always insisted on making a house into a home, but I don't want to waste anyone's time with a long speech." A polite laugh rolled through the room, soft, ready amusement. I let the pause grow long enough for people to start wondering. That's when Naomi's screen blinked at the tech booth, and Carla's liaison nodded like a man who had rehearsed the right look for this moment. "There are some matters I need to address on behalf of a number of people who believe trusts and investments were being handled honestly," I said. "We have reason to believe certain corporate accounts and a set of transactions associated with the Whitmore name are not what they appear to be." The room changed pitch. 100 faces tilted toward the screens, as the slideshow that had been tracing Claire's childhood through Polaroids flicked and split. The image shifted, and where Claire's prom photo had been, a scanned bank ledger appeared. The photographers at the back raised their cameras in reflex. Conversation collapsed into a noise like a wave hitting rock. On the large screen, the first slide showed header lines, bank names, routing numbers, dates. Naomi had highlighted a weave of transfers in bright yellow, the passage of money from investor accounts to shell companies, then to consulting accounts with names that matched Delilah Whitmore, Franklin Whitmore, and in several places, S. Williams. Following the ledger was a map Naomi had made, arrows, dates, amounts. The schematic was plain and brutal in its clarity. I watched Sloane's hands. They had gone cold. Her smile, once painted so carefully, had started to flake. Franklin tried to laugh, too loud, too early, like someone throwing gravel to distract a dog. Delilah's fingers dug into the stem of her glass until the crystal creaked. People murmured. Someone muttered that this must be a mistake. Others stood up, drawn closer. "I want to be clear about what you're seeing," I said. "These aren't rumors. Naomi Delaney, here, is a forensic accountant who has traced transfers and identified patterns consistent with investor funds being used to pay earlier investors and personal expenses, rather than to generate legitimate returns. Rebecca Thornton has filed a preliminary complaint with financial crimes based on those records." Agent Carla Reeves has reviewed our initial submission and is present tonight in a liaison capacity to protect the integrity of the investigation. I saw Claire's mouth form a small O. The head table suddenly had the look of a boat with too many holes to count. Claire reached out and gripped my hand without breaking her gaze with me, like she needed something steady to hold on to while the floor slid. On the screen that followed, the bank statements were juxtaposed with incorporation filings. Whitmore Holdings, Inc., Arizona. The address tied to a mail drop service. There were emails, screen-grabbed because that's how the trail often shows up, between an account manager at a supposed investment firm and Franklin Whitmore, arranging consulting fees. There were invoices that paid out to Delilah for administrative oversight. The names matched the patterns Naomi had highlighted. Every time the mouse hovered, a new connection lit up. "That's fraudulent misrepresentation," someone in the crowd muttered. "That's illegal." Sloane's face collapsed into something harder to read. Rage, fear, calculation. She stood abruptly as if to flee, and then sat down again when a firm hand rested on her shoulder. Her voice, when it came, was thin and brittle. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You've got nothing. These are out-of-context figures." Rebecca stepped forward in the hush, and in the cleanest voice someone can manage in the middle of a crisis, said, "We have compiled a chain of custody for these documents. We delivered them to Agent Reeves's office. They have had time to verify the transfers with the Nanks and confirm the account ownerships. This is not a collection of out-of-context figures. This is a pattern. It meets the threshold to open a federal inquiry." The liaison, young, in plain clothes, but with the practiced gravity of a man who wears procedure like armor, stood and, with a quick flip of a badge, introduced himself as Special Agent Langley from the Financial Crimes Unit. He explained calmly that an investigation was being opened and that they were there to secure certain accounts and interview relevant parties. He asked that no one leave the premises if they were part of the matter under investigation. My hands were warm in my palms where I had held the microphone. I thought about how I had once told myself that quiet competence was a kind of justice. I'd never meant it to be public spectacle. But it was the right place to cut off a route of exit, and the right time, during the toast, when attention converged, and the fewer the chances to disappear, the better. When the agents moved, they did so with the restraint and efficiency I'd been briefed on. They displayed their badges. They explained rights and what an interview would involve. They asked Delilah and Franklin to accompany them to a private room for questioning and to bring identification. They asked Sloane to make herself available for an interview.
Sloane's reaction was a study in denial and fury. "You can't do this," she snapped, voice fracturing. "You don't know. This is a witch hunt. Claire, tell them we're not criminals." Claire's hand white-knuckled the edge of the table. The color had drained from her face. She looked at Sloane, then at me, and something like the weight of an entire life, choices made in the dark, reasons for forgiveness she had kept for herself, rolled through her expression like distant weather. For a beat, she seemed trapped between a loyalty to a person she'd hoped to marry and a dawning realization that things were not as she'd been told. Agents didn't slap cuffs on anyone in the ballroom. That would have been theater we neither wanted nor needed. What happened was quieter, but no less absolute. They escorted the Whitmores and Sloane to the hotel offices for interviews and preliminary detentions, where footage, devices, and files could be cataloged in the presence of a recorded chain of custody. Agents requested passwords. Rebecca, as counsel, explained the process and arranged for legal representation to be notified. Naomi answered the agents' questions with a clarity that made it impossible for anyone at the table to pretend they hadn't seen what they'd seen. As the Whitmores were led away, the room fractured into a dozen small dramas. People whispered about how they had always suspected something. Some clung to their programs and folded them like talismans. The honeymoon smile slid away and left faces raw with curiosity and fear. Cameras flashed, phones recorded. A few guests looked at Claire like she had a visible wound, something they didn't know how to approach. Claire had always been a woman who wanted the world to give her the benefit of the doubt. I had been the one to teach myself how to withhold grace until it had earned its keep. She sat still as the agents finished their preliminary work and returned to the ballroom, not to perform, but to ensure that nothing was disrupted while procedural steps were completed. When they left the room to consult with the prosecutor's office, Claire's arms folded around herself as if to make a shell. She stood when they approached the head table again and walked over to me. Up close, sitting as she was on her wedding chair with the locket nestled against her skin, she looked like someone who had been lit from within, a woman who had wanted to be kind and who had been rewarded, perhaps, with a version of kindness that wanted her to be blind. "I didn't know," she said. The confession was small, private. "I would never. Beth, I wouldn't." Her voice broke, and for the first time that night, the room seemed to care not about spectacle and not about gossip, but about two people who had a history of leaning on the same foundation that now felt cracked. "I know," I said. The truth was complicated, She might not have known the mechanics of the money, but she had signed documents, co-signed.
Whether that made her complicit depended on what we learned in interviews. I wasn't a jury. I was her sister. I thought he loved me, Claire said, and the words were less an accusation than an explanation. I thought the talks about business were complicated, and I trusted him. You're allowed to be loved and be wrong about it, I said, because that's what people need to hear sometimes. Their capacity for error doesn't erase their dignity. You're allowed to be a person who got hurt. We'll get through this. We'll make sure you're safe. Rebecca and Agent Langley arranged a quiet place for Claire to sit with someone from our family while they completed their work. Patricia, who had been surprised and stunned in equal measure, found a chair and simply wept. It was not the dramatic weeping that fills novels. It was the slow, ruminant grieving a mother allows when a world she ordered collapses into the messy truth. The arrests that followed were not the cinematic orchestration a tabloid might dream of. They were efficient. The agents returned with handcuffs when there was probable cause and a warrant. Franklin and Delilah were informed of charges, wire fraud, conspiracy, and other counts that would be worked out as the investigation unfolded. Sloan, whose legal name, Agent Langley said quietly later, was Sandra Williams, was arrested after the agents confirmed several bank holds and a probable cause affidavit based on Naomi's forensic work and the corroborating bank statements. Agents made sure to document exactly what they were seizing: laptops, phones, a glossy folder of business cards that now looked like the props they were. Sloan screamed when someone took her phone. At first she tried to bargain, and then to plead, and finally to sob in a way that suggested either that she'd been rehearsed to perform a breakdown, or that the life she'd been running had finally run its course. Either way, the agents did their job with the calmness of people who have learned to separate the drama of a moment from the gravity of it. They read her rights, they applied restraints. They watched for any sign of a flight attempt. It was textbook, and that was precisely what the moment needed. After everyone was escorted out to the secure rooms, Agent Langley came back to the ballroom and spoke with Rebecca privately. They decided wisely to delay any public statements beyond a simple notice that an investigation was ongoing and that certain parties were in custody. We all agreed that the wedding itself was not the proper forum for further details. It was about stopping flight and preserving the chain of custody so that prosecutions could proceed fairly. That decision, more than anything else that night, satisfied the part of me that wanted the correct authorities to do their work. In the hours after, when the band offered to play another song and a few guests clung to the hope that music could repair an evening, people did what humans do. Some fled into the night, some stayed to console, some gossiped in corners. Claire sat with me in a quiet room with the door closed. The locket lay heavy in her palm, like a coin she hadn't meant to spend. "You told me once that you wanted me to stand on my own," she said quietly. She inhaled, the kind of breath that seemed to carry the weight of wedding vows and filial debts. "I didn't know this would look like that." "You didn't have to be an expert in fraud to be loved," I told her. "You were loved because you are you. Love doesn't make things transparent." She laughed once, a small, shattered sound. I thought he had a life that matched his words. "Effort goes into manufacture," I said. "People can learn to look wealthy the same way they learn to look nice in photos. That doesn't make it true." She looked at me then in a way that asked for something like absolution, or at least understanding. Did you tell them?" she asked. When she said them, it meant the guests who had laughed earlier, the friends who had singled me out as the stinky country girl. "Did you tell them you were the one who paid the checks, to prove it wasn't Claire's money?" I thought about how I'd intended to keep those checks private, as a bowl of savings is kept, hidden, useful, unspoken. But keeping them hidden had not protected Claire from being targeted. It had made her an easier mark. "No," I said. "I didn't. Not tonight." There was a reason. It wasn't pride, though some of that sat like a small, stubborn coal in my chest. It was strategy. Revealing it in the ballroom would complicate legal processes and make things messy in ways that could harm an investigation. "I'll tell you, later. If you want to know now, I'll tell you now." She nodded, and when I told her that I had been the anonymous benefactor, her face moved through a private constellation of emotions: relief, shame, bewilderment, gratitude. She folded my hands and held them like someone claiming property she had not known she owned. In the weeks that followed, the legal machinery turned. There were interviews and subpoenas that required patience. Naomi's spreadsheets became attachments for formal filings. Agent Reeves and Agent Langley coordinated with the U.S. Attorney's Office and with banks to freeze accounts that were clearly being used to move investor money. The Whitmore accounts had already shown patterns that suggested a Ponzi-like structure, money from later investors used to pay earlier ones. consulting fees that were thinly disguised personal enrichment, and shell entities that obscured true ownership. Where we could demonstrate intent and misappropriation, prosecutors moved. It is worth noting, I am careful about this, that an allegation is not a conviction. Charges were filed, the court process began. I never said in courtrooms what I said in the ballroom. I let the documents speak. The law did what the law does. It weighed evidence, allowed for defense, and sought fairness. For someone who had spent a life learning how to make hotels run on time, the law's process was slow and tidy in a way I could respect. It was not my theater. Claire cooperated with investigators. She was interviewed, documents she had signed were examined. The truth is that people can be deceived into taking part in things that later look like complicity. That distinction matters. She had signed some papers and attended meetings she trusted as an emerging partner, but there was a difference between being duped and being the architect. We could prove coercion and manipulation in several ways: text threads that suggested pressure, financial statements that she had not fully understood, and the repeated insistence from Sloan and Franklin that Claire's signature would solidify investor confidence. Those were red flags. They did not absolve ignorance, but they did provide context. Patricia, our mother, sat with me for hours in the weeks that followed. She had always been a woman who knew how to present her life in a tidy bow, and now she needed help letting the bow fall apart safely. She went to therapy, as we had discussed. There were conversations about trust and vulnerability, and the ways mothers and daughters relate to money and pride. Claire and Patricia both needed the slow, hard work of rebuilding trust with themselves and with each other. There were practical consequences beyond family therapy. Investors wanted their money. Some were sympathetic, others were not. Recovery of assets is a long and legally thorny process, winding through restitution, asset forfeiture, and settlement agreements. The federal case sought to identify and repatriate funds taken by the Whitmore enterprise. In the end, some money came back, some did not. That is the unfortunate arithmetic of fraud. Some people were hurt in ways that paperwork cannot heal. One of the things that surprised me in the aftermath was how small acts of kindness and redemption can be. A year later, a woman named Nicole Patterson sat opposite me at a table in the hotel's breakfast room. She had been one of several scholarship applicants I'd heard about through a local community center. I had started a small scholarship the year after buying the hotel, part of my quiet work to ensure others had the ladder I'd climbed. Nicole had the look of someone who had been given a second chance and taken it. A neat ponytail, a resume that read like a promise, and an old pair of boots that had probably seen better days. Over coffee, she told me that her mother had lost work during a layoff, and that she had been bouncing between part-time jobs and taking classes at night. She wanted to study business management so she could help her family, and maybe one day own a small inn on the coast. I thought of how once, not long ago, someone had thrown the phrase "stinky country girl" into the air, like it was a stone to measure the depth of someone's worth. I thought of the boots I'd worn when I'd cleaned rooms at 3 a.m. I thought of the receipts I had taped to a corkboard and pretended were trophies. Now I was the person on the other side of the ledger, dispersing funds and offering mentorship to young women like Nicole. "You know," Nicole said, stirring her tea, "my aunt told me to always dress like someone who belongs. I don't know if I'll ever be the kind of person people expect." She smiled with a lopsided bravery that was almost adorable. "You already are," I said. "There are many kinds of belonging. One is being able to pay the bills. Another is being allowed to make mistakes and to keep standing. The third is being the person who shows up when someone else needs a hand." She looked at me, then at the window, where the fountain in the courtyard threw silver glass against the sky, and for a second the noise of the world softened. "Why do you help?" she asked. "You could probably help a dozen people and still not notice the cost. Why us?" "Because I remember," I said. "There are people who decide what you're worth and then charge you admission for everything else. I don't believe in that ticket booth. If I can make sure someone gets through without paying for the admission fee to dignity, I will." When I handed Nicole the scholarship packet months later, watching her fist clutch the letter like it was a map to an island, the word "stinky" felt ridiculous and used up. It had been crafted to shame and to keep someone in a place, by warning them what others would call them if they tried to climb. But what people call you is not the architecture of your life. The foundation you build is. Claire and I spent the next year repairing our relationship in small, patient increments. There were no grand reconciliations, no miracle endings. There were appointments kept, therapy sessions attended, and a lot of honest conversations about money, trust, and how families can sometimes be the softest place and also the most dangerous. She started working with me on a community initiative to help small business owners build resilience against scams and predatory practices. She found a kind of agency in educating others about contracts and red flags, the things she wished someone had taught her before she married. Patricia came to the education nights we hosted at the hotel. She would sit in the second row, knitting, as Naomi walked people through what suspicious bank statements look like, and then she'd ask questions in her reedy voice. Watching her learn was a slow, humble redemption of her own. She apologized to Claire in a way that felt both right and awkward, a mother gently owning the ways her need for social acceptance had once clouded her judgment. It was all messy but true.
On the legal front, the case moved forward with a mix of plea deals and scheduled trials. Several parties pled guilty when they recognized the weight of forensic evidence against them. Others insisted on their innocence and exercised their right to trial. Justice is not a single glare of closure. It is slow and threaded with human choices. What mattered to me, what mattered to Claire, was that the machinery of the law had found enough to break the mechanism that had been siphoning off people's life savings. When the dust settled, there was a moment that mattered more than any press statement. Claire and I sat together in my office, the same office that had once been a walk-in storage closet bubbling with the smell of dust and possibility. She turned the locket over in her hand and then handed it to me. "Keep it," she said, "not because I don't want it, but because you gave me something I couldn't ask for without shame." I looked at her for a long time. "I don't want it for possession," I said. "I want it where it can remind us. You can have it when you need it." She laughed, a clean sound for once. "Promise me one thing," she said. "If you ever want to be recognized for what you've done, really recognized, let me do it. Let me be the one to stand up and say thank you." I nodded. There are gifts that are private and gifts that are public. I was content to let some things be the quiet scaffolding until they were safe to make visible. But I also wanted my sister to be able, when she was ready, to name help and to accept it without shame. As months stretched into a year, our lives found a new rhythm. The hotel continued to grow. We added a program that offered legal clinics and financial literacy sessions twice a month. Naomi came to speak. Rebecca taught a class about reading the fine print. Agent Reeves agreed to guest speak on fraud prevention. Claire, healed in ways that still appeared fragile, chaired a committee to help victims navigate restitution claims. There were still moments that stung. An old colleague who made a cutting joke about my origins, a guest who balked when the bill came and tried to insinuate lack of polish. But those were small and manageable, because the foundation underneath was firm, and because the people who mattered understood what had been built. Sometimes late at night when the ballroom lights were down and the soundproofing had done its work, I would walk across the marble in my boots and remember the line tossed like a pebble into a pond. "Stinky country girl." I would trace the echo of the word and let it dissolve into something that no longer had power. The marble had a warmth to it, and the boots had scuffs that told stories of hands that had labored. The ledger entries I framed on my wall were not for showing off, but to remind me that authenticity was the thing I wanted to cultivate. People ask me often, friends, guests, young entrepreneurs at events, how I handled it. They want a formula, a retreat to a tidy moral. There isn't one. There is the practice of looking, paying attention to small inconsistencies, listening when something sounds rehearsed, and then arranging competent help. There is the practice of patience, letting experts do their work and not turning a moment of justice into a spectacle of humiliation. And there is the practice of mercy, offering it to those who ask for it, but not mistaking mercy for weakness. I still get emails from viewers and listeners who heard about the incident. The footage of the slideshow leaked in those first frantic hours and made the rounds in ways I never intended. They write about being underestimated in their lives because of where they came from, the jobs they held, the names they answered to. They write about being told not to reach higher because they know their place. They tell me their stories, and then they ask simple, brave things. How do I stop being defined by other people's words? My answer is practical and stubborn. Build a life where people's judgments matter less than your work. Learn ledgers, read contracts, keep receipts, and learn who to ask when things don't add up. Surround yourself with competent people, those who will tell you the truth, even if it stings. And when you have the chance to catch someone else without making it their humiliation, do it. If I am honest, there is a part of me that still enjoys the quiet poetry of irony. The phrase "stinky country girl" that once slapped like a cheap insult is now, in my head, a kind of banner. It reminds me that language can wound, yes, but language can also be reclaimed. I own the ground I walk on, literally, now. Papers filed, deeds stamped.
I know the boilers in the back office and the faces of the night staff, the ones who answer when a pipe bursts at 2 in the morning. I know the small, anonymous acts that create safety. Claire and I have come to a kind of peace that is imperfect and real. We go to therapy together sometimes. We mark holidays with more openness and fewer performances. There are still hard conversations. There are still things we flinch at. But the core of us, the thing that stood in the hallway the night the phone rang and decided to act, is intact. On the anniversary of the wedding, an odd marker to celebrate, we hosted a community breakfast in the ballroom. Nicole stood at a microphone, the scholarship certificate in her hands, and spoke about how an ordinary kindness had changed her life. People who had been guests that night a year ago sat at tables now as allies. Naomi, Rebecca, Wesley, and Agent Reeves sat together like an unlikely panel. We talked about prevention and about second chances. When Nicole finished, she looked at me and said, "To the woman who wore boots on Italian marble and kept a place warm for strangers and family alike, thank you." The hall erupted, not in the cruel way it had once applauded a staged image, but with something softer, recognition. I don't pretend that the truth about that night erased every awkward glance or every old division. It didn't, nor did I ever want it to. I wanted a restorative justice that protected others and allowed those who erred a chance to make amends when they could. In the end, that is what happened. People who had committed crimes faced the consequences. Victims got some restitution. Claire and I stitched a relationship back together with thread and therapy and stubborn practice. There is one last thing I keep in my desk drawer, alongside a stack of invoices and the framed copy of the deed. It is a small card someone once gave me with a phrase that helped me through nights of doubt. Quiet work is not small work. I read it when I need a reminder that the labor of care, of leaving a life to scout for others, is not minor because it is hidden. If you have ever been told where you belong because of the clothes you wore or the town you came from, know this: places change, people change. The people who sneer are often the ones whose costumes give them a false sense of security. The real power lies in learning what matters: skills, integrity, perseverance, and then showing up for others. If you've been underestimated, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment sharing a time someone misjudged you, or a moment when you reclaimed your ground. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, follow along for the next one. We put the locket back on Claire's neck in private months later, when the cameras weren't there and when the gesture could be just between sisters. She laughed when she placed it, an honest, slightly embarrassed sound. "Don't make it a symbol for me," she said. "Make it a symbol for both of us." "I will," I said, and I meant it, not as a boast, but as a promise. The necklace would be a reminder of what quiet work and clear evidence could do when combined with courage and care. It would be a reminder that being underestimated gives you the advantage of surprise. We walked through the hotel that day, past the ballroom where the chandelier had caught a word and thrown it back as glitter. I looked at the tile beneath my boots and thought how many times I'd counted the seams and found my way forward. The marble felt warm, like a floor that remembered every foot that had passed over it, boots and heels, old hands and new ones. Downstairs, the staff laughed about a small hiccup with the linens and a double-booked suite, and I smiled because I knew the kind of life I'd built, a messy, beautiful thing that had room for error, repair, and occasionally triumph. They had called me a stinky country girl in a room full of glass and glitter. They found out too late for them that the woman they dismissed owned the building, the accounts, and the quiet means to protect those she loved. It is not a perfect ending. It is not a one-line victory. But it is real. Justice pursued, people held accountable, family restored slowly, and a life used to help others climb. If this resonates with you, tell me a moment when someone underestimated you and how you moved forward. I read every comment. And if you want more stories of people who rebuilt and reclaimed, subscribe to hear the next one.